Hello, everyone. Happy 2021. This is the first official webinar of Enterprise Racism and Oppression Awareness Program, what we love calling it as ROAP. We have a great first webinar planned for all of you today. And for those who don't know me, my name is Kenneth Kwok. I go by pronouns he, him, and his. I am the founder and president of Better Together Foundation based in Hong Kong. As well, I am honored to serve as Vice President of Diversity, Accessibility, and Inclusion at InterPride. What I love doing with these type of webinars is, again, make it lively. We're not here to, frankly, educate. We're here to share. We're here to say what's on our mind, what's bugging us, allow us to be a bit more vulnerable. And frankly, during COVID times, which are still going on, try to find a bit of warmth and hope in every single session we tune into, especially on Zoom. Before I introduce the actual topic, I always love to introduce the speakers first because that is more important than the actual topic discussed. I am going to start with Imania. Hello, Imania. Do you mind giving everyone a quick introduction of yourself?
Ala falava le pa ia mana mamalo le au mai mo le nei fontsanga o mawhai o ave nga tu taf. I pena tawhailangi. Ia o lo ui moa o la le tau moa mo le ana tele tu sina Imania Brown Gabriel. O te sau mai whalatai sa napu so na inu mai vaseuta. Ai o lo o wau mau I Queensland nei Australia. Wanga ngam se au lo whenga iai. Yeah, hi everyone. My name, watching this online webinar, I am Tuisina Imania Brown from Samoa. I am a Matai chief in 3 villages of Whalatai, Sanapu and Tuanai, and I come from Vaivasilta and currently live in Brisbane for work. It is an honor for me to be here with my colleagues to share some thoughts on Indigenous LGBTI communities from Samoa and how we manage our daily lives and daily struggles. In Samoa, the collective name for LGBTIQ is Whawhawhine and Whaatama. We don't have names for gay, lesbian, bisexual, intersex, queer. It's all lumbered in the Samoan language under the umbrella terms of Whawhawhine, which is essentially effeminate males, and Whaatama, trans or masculine females. Even the term trans doesn't exist in Samoan language. And transgender, there's no word for it. We are all together as Whawhawhine and Whaatama. Life in Samoa as Whawhawhine and Whaatama is governed by 3 things. First of all, there is the Whasamoa, or the way of life, how you live your life, culture. Secondly, the rule of law. The laws that govern and protect citizens' lives. And thirdly, religion, or the church. And everything. I mean, every village in Samoa has at least one denomination or church. You drive around the country, and the one thing that sticks out is how many churches there are in such a small country. After all, our country's motto is Samoa is founded on God. You can already see the potential minefields this triumvirate causes. And Samoa, Whawhawhine and Whaatama navigate those minefields very, very carefully. Whawhawhine and Whaatama are embedded in families or ainu and are accepted by them as part of the community. So it's very rare for us to see or hear of any Whawhawhine or Whaatama being ostracized because of who they are. These happen mainly when younger Whawhawhine and Whaatama choose to move from rural communities to the cities. And the Samoa Whawhawhine Association is highly visible in its advocacy and the work that it does. And it puts on shows to fundraise for the elderly, which endears them to the public because Samoan people are very close to their elderly. So when they see supposedly sinners fundraise and give to the elderly, it endears them to the public. In more recent years, the Samoa Whawhawhine Association has intersected their advocacy and lobbying work with other sectors, like women's committees in rural villages, because when the public attacks Whawhawhine and Whaatama, guess who's at the forefront defending Whawhawhine and Whaatama? these other intersectional sectors, women's committees out there defending Fa'afafine and Fatama. Of course, the most vociferous opponents of Fa'afafine and Fatama are the new wave of Pentecostal Anglican-based churches and denominations, quite often with very young preachers. Regularly, their attacks on social media and mainstream media causes uproar, usually around the issue of Fa'afafine trans with their choice of female clothing, their bravado living their lives online, and also their sexual exploits, going against the Bible, sinning, homosexuality, all of that. And less so, not much attacks on Fatama. It's a delicate operation. It is a delicate way of life, trying to balance working and supporting your family and your commitments to them through your culture and the Samoa, and then making sure not to fall afoul of the law or break any laws, which is the rule of law, which incidentally Samoa has repealed its female personation laws and homosexuality in 2013, but still has the crimes of sodomy and keeping a place of resorts for homosexuality on its books, which we are working to try and get that overturned. And also to be committed to one's church or religion without incurring the wrath of the religious right. So that is
Great. Thank you so much. Well, Boyd, are you ready to go next?
Yeah, thank you. Danse, kaki anuagu magantik. Unitikis kwapu nekutsinia. Egwamaga ewigiana maskutsi wiskaigenik. Hi, my name is Boyd, all my relations. I'm from Satellite Cree Nation here in Treaty 6 territory, which is located near Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, in North America, or also known as Turtle Island. I'm grateful to be here today. Is it okay if we repeat the question? Or are we just introducing ourselves?
Yeah, I think it's more a friendly self-introduction to the InterPride and global community. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm here representing the Edmonton Two-Spirit Society, which is a contingent of the international Two-Spirit Societies here in North America as part of the Two-Spirit resurgence, which started in like the mid-70s. So my local group here actually received a ceremony name called Rainbow Healing Lodge in Sweat Lodge. So I'm here on behalf of them, also to represent the Indigiqueer / Two-Spirit community within my territory. So I'd just like to, get to Tamskat Dinawao, greetings, in a friendly and good way. Bye.
Thank you. I am so excited to learn more from both of you. And I have the honor to introducing my favorite ex-co-president, Sir J. Andrew Baker. Do you mind? I'm sure everyone knows who you are, but why not introduce yourself in a new way in 2021?
Ani we na bojon in the way maganadok nimki beneshi indigenous cause wabajeshi and dodem chimnissing and don jaba ngichinenda mampi bejanung gwa gigado gigado min gichea ya ga bimadazian. Hello, everybody. Hello, all my relations. My name is Andrew Baker, and I come originally from Canada. I come from a mixed family, but have connections to the Anishinaabe people of Turtle Island. I'm a language speaker of Anishinaabemowin, and specifically the dialect of Ojibwe, and I've worked for a long time within Two-Spirit and Indigiqueer spaces. I've always kind of more identified as Indigiqueer simply, but as a collective community, the Two-Spirit community is absolutely amazing, and it really defines how we come together as Indigenous people around the globe. I live now in Switzerland, so it's interesting in a very contextual sense. And Boyd will laugh at this, but I've left my homeland, so there's always kind of a giggle on that one. I've crossed the big waters, and there's some interesting teachings around that, but that's another discussion. So yeah, so I come from about 20 years worth of activism within the Pride movement and within Indigenous spaces, working within the Friendship Center movement in Canada. And I work with a number of international LGBT organizations and a number of Indigenous orgs. Last year, I was on the organizing committee for the Indigenous pre-conference of AIDS 2020, which was a really amazing experience working with so many queer and LGBT supportive Indigenous folk out there. That's a bit about me in this framework, but we'll learn more as it goes on.
And I think this now is the time for me to actually introduce the panel topic. So just a bit of background on the Racism and Oppression Awareness Program. It was founded during COVID in 2020, when we are investigating as a global pride movement. Are we really just talking the talk and about the need to be diverse and inclusive while not giving the voice to all the relevant stakeholders and spectrum members of the LGBTQIA+ community? And of course, it also echoed a lot of the issues faced by our friends in the United States, as well as globally, on racism. But we define racism and oppression as a global phenomenon. And for this particular topic, we want to discuss, the impact of colonization on the Indigenous Two-Spirited and the LGBTQIA+ experiences on three key issues. One is migration, second is mobility, and third is relational violence. J. Andrew, I would love for you to kick off this conversation. Frankly, you have been a bright leader in the InterPride movement, and now your thoughts on this is extremely appreciated, not only from the perspective of, I believe, diversity and inclusion, but what InterPride as a global organization can do to not only raise awareness, but also potentially explore community-based grassroots options to help us address these issues on the oppression on the Two-Spirited community. So off to you, sir.
So I guess the first place to open is, as I think that those three topics are very complex, and yes, they're within the Pride movement and within the issues that Indigenous people face within our homelands and within our territories and as we move about the world. I also want to highlight, Kenneth, when you were talking about the subject of this webinar, when you mentioned relational violence, we had a conversation about that. And I want to highlight that relational violence is often community violence. It's often unconscious bias, systemic oppression, people not knowing their histories as settlers in what those processes are. But most importantly, as I open this discussion, the first thing that I want to acknowledge is I do want to acknowledge that two of us as speakers come from the global north, and one of our speakers comes from the global south. And Yamanya, you have a very powerful voice and perspective, and I want to ensure that you have opportunities to speak. And I do want to acknowledge the limitations that this webinar has as the first webinar on Indigenous issues at InterPride. There are a number of Indigenous voices not present in this conversation. During Global Pride, as a number of you will remember, Boyd, you were one of the people that I worked with for the Indigenous statement at Global Pride. And it's actually a really good place to open up this discussion. There was a request during the coordination of Global Pride. And of course, I was the token Indigenous person on the coordinating committee at the time. So I got asked to help coordinate. And I was happy to do it, but it's often that case if you're a person of a specific identity group, person of color, a person from Asia, a person from the global South, person of Pacific ancestry. There's always an unconscious tokenization that happens sometimes, that there's an assumption that you're well connected or aware of your culture or able and willing and desiring to speak within that framework, within the spaces that you're within. And that's an example sometimes of unconscious relational violence, if we look at it in that sense. But I was asked at the time if Indigenous people would do a global land acknowledgement. Boyd, you may remember some of these discussions, but one of the challenges was actually engaging in a dialogue of education with non-Indigenous folk, that it shouldn't be Indigenous folk acknowledging the land that was taken from us. It's the role of Indigenous people to have relationship with settlers and people trying to shift the power dynamics of colonization. And what we decided at the time, we were able to be heard well enough at the time that we said, we will acknowledge lands and processes and ancestries and frameworks, but we will work as a global group of people to make a statement about the experiences of queer Indigenous people and about a call out to non-Indigenous folk to stand with what's happening in our nations, in our communities, in the reasons why we exist. And it became a fairly powerful statement. It was delivered by Boyd. It was delivered by Beck Johnson from Australia, Goring woman, really amazing spirit. And it was also delivered by a Sapmi or Sami young man from Northern Norway, doing some really amazing political work. And so I don't want to open up the limitations that we don't have any Sami voices here. We don't have any African Indigenous voices here. We don't have any voices from what's today called Latin America or South America. There are many voices not present in this conversation. And what the three of us will bring in today is our own unique experiences and knowledge from working with people around the globe and within our communities. But I do want to highlight to everybody listening to this webinar that you need to connect with your local Indigenous groups. You need to build relationships. You need to find out how to engage and how to support. And that's not, and very rarely is that about you saying what you're able to provide. It's about listening and engaging and finding the framework. As Indigenous people, we work differently. When I think about migration, our migration stories are inherently connected with land in a very different way. And that's part of our stories, that's part of our teachings, that's part of our cultural dialogues. But also in modern history, migration has been used as a weapon against Indigenous people. Forced migration. As an example, the Inuit people of Northern Canada being forced to migrate to far northern territories compared to where they were originally from, where their homelands were, to defend, quote unquote, Canada's borders at the time. Forced migrations are part of the reality of Indigenous peoples. And it becomes a reality within the global pride movement that as we engage in big cities, right now I'm sitting on Long Island just outside of New York. I'm sitting in an unceded territory of Indigenous people that's filled with vineyards run by settlers, surrounded with Indigenous communities that are still here. And that history isn't taught enough. And so if it's not taught enough within the mainstream, it's definitely not taught enough within queer and LGBT communities in terms of how we can engage. And so that's just a little bit of my opening. And I'm going to hand it over to Yamanya or Boyd to comment more.
Yeah, thank you. Why don't we start with YB, but please unmute yourself. Thank you.
So this is ultimately about resources. And the biggest countries where this type of settler colonialism is a huge problem are, of course, the big North countries like Canada, the United States, Australia, South Africa, right? Countries which are traditionally rich in raw materials and resources that colonial powers have come and have taken over. They tried to do it in India Thank God India came to their senses and kicked them the hell out of their country. Why does this particular brand of colonialism, why does it link specifically to the issues that we're talking about, which is migration, mobility, and relational violence? Well, because he who controls the country, right, the new sovereignty, the new sovereigns now, the new sovereign powers, they control migration. They want to control people coming into a country. They control the migration. And of course, LGBTI people are right at the bottom of the ladder in terms of that, right? This is about capitalist power, hungry, and control of resources. These countries do. They will only bring in migrants who can help them build their wealth. Migrant workers, you all know, populations that travel around and are migrant workers to these richer industrialized countries, but to migrate there and have a go. See, this is the thing. We have a very disjointed notion of what success is right now in 2021. For us, success is about having a house and a car and living comfortably and being able to go to a supermarket and buy whatever you want and send your kids to a very expensive school. That's not what Indigenous communities are about. I'm sorry, but that's not our dream. Our dream is about resources. Our dream is about managing climate change. In the Pacific, right? The nation of Kiribati has bought acreage in Fiji, in another country. They bought like 20 hectares. And in 20 years, that whole country, that whole culture is going to migrate and live within another country. This is what we worry about. We don't give a damn about the price of gold or, or the stock price index or whatever. But the thing is, it's a lot more deeper than that. This connection that we have over migration and mobility and relational violence, right? You don't see much of it happening in the Pacific or Latin American countries or Asian countries. And I'll tell you why. Indigenous LGBTI populations very much are inserted in their communities. They are a part of their communities in Asian countries, in Latin American countries, and the Caribbean, in the Pacific countries. You don't see us running for cover at the hate and violence that our brothers and sisters who live in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in European countries, that they're facing from these, anti-LGBTI regimes. You don't see that happening because we are a part of communities. And when they attack us, they don't just attack us, they attack our communities, and they're very, very afraid to do that. And this is the thing that we're always speaking about when we're talking about Indigenous communities. The notion of intersectionality is very up and forefront in all of our discussions. The notion that, and this is something that World Pride does very well, it intersects different populations to make sure that the agenda is driven forward. World Pride does that better than most organizations out there. Intersectionality is the concept of weaving. It is about weaving my future and my successes to yours, Kenneth, to yours, Boyd, to yours, Andrew. If I succeed, I take all three of you with me. If Andrew succeeds, we go with Andrew. It is about weaving our struggles, whether it's climate change, whether it's social justice, whether it's racism, whether it's inequality, whether it's gender-based violence, whatever it is, we weave our struggles. And LGBTI people in the Pacific have done that very well by weaving their struggles with women's movements, with women's groups, local rural women's communities, because when they attack the LGBTI, guess who's standing in front of the LGBTI? The women. The rural women are standing in front, and they stop all that nonsense, right? Because we, at the end of the day, you all know, we are somebody's child. We have a mother somewhere there that cares for us, an auntie that cares for us, The other thing I wanted to mention very, very briefly is, with the onset of colonialism, of course, and settler colonialism, they brought a nice little gift for us. monotheistic religions, right? All of a sudden, everything. And you know the danger that they brought with that? The doctrine of the supremacy of the binary. When we all know, and science knows, that there is more than one gender. There is more than one gender, you know? And it's like, I mean, you look at my community, the Fafafina community, the Two-Spirit community in Canada, the Katois, you know, like in Thailand, like the Hijra, you know, like in every country, there is a name for people like us. But we've been replaced by religion and the notion of Christian supremacy to like male and female, you know, like, hello, it's not true. So anyway, big problems, but Andrew is right. We need to make sure that in our discussions, there's a seat made for these other populations that are not present. How do we do that? Man, find the money. Find the money and get global pride or world pride to host one big badass indigenous conference, right? On indigenous lands, right? Get everybody there, right? And let them talk and let them solve the world's problems. I tell you, you will not be disappointed. Those folks in the global north sitting in their ivory towers will just be like, yeah, okay, here's some money, go and, you know, and let us do our thing. Let us impart some intellectual property that is protected, some indigenous knowledge. Let us show you how to actually curb forest fires. Let us show you how to slow the rising tides. Let us show you how to do that. Let indigenous populations take charge, as what we've done for thousands and thousands of years, you know, before colonialism and settler colonialism and the fight for resources and mining. Before that, destroyed our planet. So anyway, lots to talk about later when we ask them some other questions, but listen, like our own positionalities, Boyd's and yours, Ken's and yours, Andrew, like we need to leverage this to make sure that that gathering is happening. You know, I feel it in my bones, that gathering of indigenous populations around the world. Like we have world conferences for ILGA and World Pride has their world conferences. We need one for indigenous populations. We need one. It has to happen and it will happen.
Well, definitely, I think one of the reasons why we host such fantastic sessions on these topics is, as Andrew correctly points out, even as an organization, we have to admit that we drop the ball sometimes. And hopefully in 21, as we all rebound and recover from COVID, there's a lot more to recover than economically. There is psychologically, there's mentally, and there's definitely more room for improvement on focusing on indigenous issues. And now, Boyd, thank you for your patience.
And you know the danger that they brought with that? The doctrine of the supremacy of the binary. When we all know, and science knows, that there is more than one gender. There is more than one gender, you know? And it's like, I mean, you look at my community, the Fafafina community, the Two-Spirit community in Canada, the Katois, you know, like in Thailand, like the Hijra, you know, like in every country, there is a name for people like us. But we've been replaced by religion and the notion of Christian supremacy to like male and female, you know, like, hello, it's not true. So anyway, big problems, but Andrew is right. We need to make sure that in our discussions, there's a seat made for these other populations that are not present. How do we do that? Man, find the money. Find the money and get global pride or world pride to host one big badass indigenous conference, right? On indigenous lands, right? Get everybody there, right? And let them talk and let them solve the world's problems. I tell you, you will not be disappointed. Those folks in the global north sitting in their ivory towers will just be like, yeah, okay, here's some money, go and, you know, and let us do our thing. Let us impart some intellectual property that is protected, some indigenous knowledge. Let us show you how to actually curb forest fires. Let us show you how to slow the rising tides. Let us show you how to do that. Let indigenous populations take charge, as what we've done for thousands and thousands of years, you know, before colonialism and settler colonialism and the fight for resources and mining before that destroyed our planet. So anyway, lots to talk about later when we ask some other questions, but listen, like our own positionalities, Boyd's and yours, Ken's and yours, Andrew, like we need to leverage this to make sure that that gathering is happening. You know, I feel it in my bones, that gathering of indigenous populations around the world. Like we have world conferences for ILGA and World Pride has their world conferences. We need one for indigenous populations. We need one. It has to happen and it will happen.
Those three topics for colonization here in Canada and how it's affected my people and the indigenous populations here within Canada, well, quote unquote Canada. So the first thing that comes to mind for relational violence and my personal experience with that in the LGBT community, mainstream community. So right now it's a funny story because a little unique, I guess you could say, here in Edmonton, like there's literally no Pride Festival as of 2019, and there's been no parade since 2018. And the reason being, it was the QT BIPOC, so the queer, trans, indigenous, Black people of color, who came together and they voiced as a collective, a unified front to the organizers and the leaders within that Pride Festival about systemic structures and systemic racism that's been going on. And so they did a protest to stop the parade, to basically bring it back to its roots, you know, to remind people that it's a protest rather than a celebration, rather than, you know, leaning on these corporations for funds in order to put something on that basically, what do you call it, advertises lust rather than love, which I think is important in its roots, like to remind us that that's the reason why we do this, because as humans, like we all deserve to be loved. And I thought it was very important here to kind of dish that information out on the global scale for anyone listening at home, you know, joining in on this conference, that, you know, when I was sitting with what it means to be in a leadership position within the LGBT community at large, as well as within my Indigenous community, that you know, like the traditional people are watching these Pride movements everywhere. And one thing that they did notice is they promote a lot of lust. And I think it's important to keep in mind that like this is and should come from a place of love in how we conduct ourselves, especially for the generations yet to come, to keep that history alive and the truth in why we're walking this path together. But yeah, like back to the part when here in Edmonton with the QT BIPOC community calling out those, you know, systemic racism within the community. The role that the Two-Spirit community played on the municipal level here in Edmonton was that it was kind of like returning to our traditional roles within society, like playing that mediation role, stepping in with like standing in solidarity basically with our QT BIPOC relatives because of the shared plight or, you know, the challenges that we face as marginalized communities within the larger mainstream LGBT community. But also I think since then, it's been almost a year and a half now. So we're really working on building those relations within the community, amongst organizations, you know, on the individual level, as well as like the organizational levels, to share resources, programs, and things of that nature. Because we're literally building ourselves from the ground up, and we need to do it in a good way where all the voices are heard and uplifted by using each other's resources and power and privilege to make sure that like the marginalized voices get a piece of the pie, so to speak. And navigating all of this it's like really important to keep in mind how we speak of the community and of ourselves, to keep it in a positive light, because there's a concept within the Indigenous community called lateral violence. And so like, say if there's jealousy, or, you know, if you see someone being successful, it's very important to like keep that light shining and to be uplifting, because having that crab in the bucket mindset is very damaging, not only to like self, but within the community. I've experienced it. I see a lot of people experience it within the community. So I think it's so important to be mindful of, like, it's the golden rule: if you don't have nothing nice to say, don't say anything at all. So yeah, that's one aspect of those three different components of this discussion. So I'll give it back to you, Kenneth.
Oh, thank you. You know, in my mind, and first of all, I do have to openly admit that I have personally limited understanding of the Two-Spirited community and the problems they face. If I'm being honest, that is something that I am not familiar with, even though I was, you know, had the privilege of living in Canada. And it is my hope that, as Jay Andrew says, that three things could happen out of this initial conversation. And I say initial because I do believe that we should definitely bring in, if not YB, a physical conference, why don't we take the baby step of hosting a virtual conference, right? As a start. And maybe we align it with World Pride and all these amazing activities that's happening. And frankly, as a person with a little bit of background in finance, I just quickly looked through all the sponsors for World Pride in 2019. How awesome would it be to just direct one of those sponsors to focus on Indigenous issues? Do we need 55 global sponsors all supporting the same? Again, the whole Pride movement, a lot of people ask me my opinion about the flag that I have as my virtual background, right? Is it truly representative? I'm like, no, there are a lot of issues and communities not being represented. So in my mind, why don't we rebuild the fabric of this whole entire spectrum of LGBTQIA+++++. And again, I would hope to work on a sponsorship proposal with the fundraising team, hopefully focusing on Indigenous issues, just like with ROAP. You know, thanks to InterPride, we have a $5,000 budget to advance racism or oppression. Why don't we take a look and see whether we can divert or fundraise for Indigenous issues? Again, I'm talking as I reflect on the wisdom parted on to me today by the three of you. The next round, I hope, given our unfortunate restriction of time, as all good things have to come to a finale, a temporary one, I may add. YB, I want to go back to you first on this particular topic. How do you see, you clearly work with a lot of NGOs, you work with a lot of stakeholders in this global conversation on Indigenous issues. If you have one wish to elevate this conversation on a more global scale, to bring in more engagement, what would that wish be for you? And I would ask the same of the two other panelists as well.
Stop the tokenism. Stop the tokenism. You know, like we are living cultures. We are living people. Don't be tokenistic about our presence and our participation. Don't just allocate like a 2-minute soundbite for us, you know. Stop the tokenism. Like we're done. We're done. This is 2021. We are all facing a global pandemic, and this is not going to go away very, very soon. So, you know, you've got to stop being tokenistic about Indigenous cultures. Recognize that Indigenous communities have probably, you know, survived much longer than your iPhone, and will probably be around much longer than your iPhone. So recognize that and allocate enough resources for us to sort of say, hey, you know, and if as Andrew and Boyd have said, if there is no room at the table, make room at the table. To all my global North counterparts, make room at the table. You know, ask, you be the ally. You know, this is my challenge to all of you, you know, European global North participants. You know, if you're in a meeting and you see no Indigenous communities, ask why. Ask why. Be our champions, you know, much like we're championing your causes. Champion our causes for once, but stop the tokenism. Like, you know, it does nobody any favors.
Straight to the point. I like that. As I said, we have, even InterPride, we have a lot of areas of improvement on that. So please bear with us. Boyd, on to you, and then I'll leave J. Andrew conclude this part of this conversation.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, but do you have anything to add, Boyd, on this? Just one wish. One wish. If you can tell everyone to do this one thing, what would that be?
I think alongside the Indigenous peoples across the globe, definitely in solidarity with the QT BIPOC relatives, is definitely to uplift their voices just as much. Although, like, it's very important to acknowledge the autonomy of both groups in all of their respective territories. But I also think it's important that, as you know, the Indigenous voices are uplifted, that the QT BIPOCs are as well.
That's a very fair point. So you've heard so far, no tokenism and QT BIPOC representation. J. Andrew, what would you like to add to that?
Before I say kind of my one wish, I want to recap some of the things that really impacted me about some of what we heard today from myself or from Yamanya, Boyd, etc. And I go back to a couple of things. I go back to first, one of the things that I think that I want to send out message-wise is our identities don't fit within your letters. Our ways of being in our communities. Am I a gay man? Yes, in a very colonial sense. I am a gay man, 100%. Am I cisgendered? Yes, I have never medically altered my body. Am I conforming within that gender? No. Do I fit within colonial constructs of who I am sexually, socially, culturally? You don't understand how I define the world. You would have to spend time in my ceremonies, in my community's way of being to understand how I see the world. It's different than how a colonial or settler mindset views the world. My primary connection is my roles and my responsibilities to the communities that I call home, to the communities that I come from the communities who recognize me as part of their family. And family goes well beyond blood. I have aunties and uncles for days. That is just part of who we are. And so does Two-Spirit work as a label to be able to identify that we look different in terms of how we move about in our identities and our experiences? Yes, it does. Does it fully define it? No, I'm a Gokwe. If I use the term, that is one of the terms that you could identify me with. You know, I am on the call with a Fa'afafine power woman. Sorry, I'm going to say that. But, you know, these are identities that people need to understand and come to learn and ask questions. And when I think about the topic of what we're talking about, when I think about, Yamanya brought up religion. Whether we're talking British colonialism, Dutch colonialism, Spanish colonialism, French colonialism, some of them were better around criminalization of LGBT identities. Some of them were absolutely horrible. When you look at the Pacific and Caribbean islands and places all around the world, the impacts of British colonialism are still there in penal code laws and whatnot. But they're also still there in my home communities in Canada. It took me 10 years to be able to ask youth at a friendship center if they identified with anything other than straight, and to put other in a gender marker space. That is rooted within the colonialism that has impacted our local communities and the religion that came with it. Nothing against Christianity, nothing against the religions that have defined it, but there has been a very long history, not only outside of Europe, but within Europe, of the impacts of religious enforcement on Indigenous ways of being. And we're just seeing a resurgence in places like Ireland, in places like Iceland, of their Indigenous traditional ways of being. And there's power in that connection. When I think about Boyd speaking about lateral violence within Indigenous communities and how we respond to that, the Pride movement, the LGBT movement as a whole globally, experiences so many similar traumas. The LGBT community is a marginalized community from the global whole. We have been impacted by colonization. We have been impacted by criminalization. We have been impacted by having things taken away from us. Indigenous people have a lot to show in terms of resilience in responding to that. Yes, we have our issues. Yes, we have that process. Lateral violence has been a part of my life. It's a reality. It's something that I must navigate. And I haven't only experienced it in Indigenous community. I've experienced it quite often in LGBT community. And I think that the LGBT community has a lot to learn from Indigenous folk in the way that we move in the world and in the way that we attempt to relate to each other. Sometimes failing, yes. Sometimes not always great, 100%, but it's there. There's so much more to this conversation. But if I could say one thing beyond tokenism and beyond the things that brought up, so many people will engage in talking about the Indigenous discussion. They'll read a book, they'll talk to Yamania, they'll talk to me, they'll attend a seminar and a conference, and then walk out the door and they won't do anything. And I'm sorry, I'm going to close with this. If I see one more non-Indigenous person do a land claim acknowledgement at a Pride in the world without actually following it up with some kind of action, I'm traveling right now to visit family and loved ones. It's been a very interesting journey, humbling journey to see what it's like to move in a world, to migrate in a world during a pandemic. One of my first days returning to Canada from Switzerland was a news announcement that the administration would not be able to provide clean drinking water to our communities, to all of our communities in Canada by their intended deadline. And that really impacted me. It really affected me. Like first day back home in a space where I'm like, oh, and then this happens. It really struggles that I sit in a Pride event in Thunder Bay or in Ottawa or in Toronto or in LA or wherever in the world, and there's this acknowledgement of the traditional keepers of that land or who were originally inherited of that land. And it's this acknowledgement, it's this awareness, but there is no call to action and there's no commitment to action by those organizations. There's no commitment to action by that individual as to what they're meaningfully going to do now that they know that. And there's no relational process. Go ahead, acknowledge the land, but also give that space for those Indigenous people to speak. Give that space, open it up, and understand that we don't follow settler processes. That's not how we work. And if we need to, we will be warriors. But warriors always, in our traditions, come with kindness and love and a whole bunch of things. My community talks about 7 sacred teachings and how we move in the world and relate to each other. And do I succeed in those 7 sacred teachings? No, not. I mean, I try. You do your best. You flounder every single time. You might not be brave enough one day, or you might not have enough humility, or you might have forgot to love yourself or another, or you might not be standing in your truth, or it might be too terrifying to be honest with yourself or someone else, or you might not have an understanding of the knowledge that you know to actually turn it into wisdom, but you try your best. And so if I can turn anything out to people out of this, it's that this isn't just about learning about us as people. We aren't part of your history, we're part of your present, and we're a huge part of your future. So if you're going to engage with Indigenous community, it's not about acknowledging it with us. It's about having a relationship with us, standing with us, supporting us, and asking us what actions you can do to help us, and actually taking those actions. Take an action.
I think this is a great way to wrap up this first session as part of the Racism and Oppression Awareness Program on Indigenous issues and on Two-Spirited issues. And as Andrew correctly says, alphabets do not define you. Frankly, it doesn't define anyone. So how about this? Why don't we as a team each give an action that you believe people such as myself, who is learning and also wishing to act on supporting this community, guide us, please, on what are the actions that we can do. And hopefully as a follow-up, we will, before we have a second conversation on Indigenous issues as part of Racism and Oppression Awareness Month or program, we are going to publish that list of actions so that we can all join in this on a broader and more engaging manner. Thank you so much to Imania, Boyd, and J. Andrew for this great, insightful, and action-focused session. And for those who are wanting to learn more about InterPride and how they can contribute to Indigenous issues, please message us. All our information is available online, as well. Reach us to us on social media and share your thoughts. Once again, thank you so much, and hope everyone stays safe. Look after your loved ones as we all recover as a community, a planet, and frankly, we owe our thanks to the amazing work that all of us on this particular panel has done in advancing equality on a truly cohesive and inclusive manner. Thank you so much.